After humiliating the maid, the son of millionaires loses everything, and his parents teach him a lesson. Hello, welcome, like, subscribe, and activate notifications. In 1980, a young woman and a young man met at a fruit and vegetable fair. The young man was named Michael, and he was a trader there. The young woman was named Rachel, and she was also a trader at the location. Both came from humble families, and their livelihood came from the fruits and vegetables they grew to later sell at the fair. A friendship began between the two that eventually evolved into a romantic relationship. Both worked hard, waking up before the rooster crowed and sleeping only when exhaustion hit them. It was a tiring routine, but quite rewarding. Over time, Rachel and Michael started living together. Their life was simple, but they were very happy. However, luck unexpectedly knocked on their door. Rachel had a habit of playing the lottery, and although Michael thought they would never win, one day Rachel screamed with happiness at home. They had won the prize. It wasn't a millionaire amount, but it was an amount they would need to work their entire lives to achieve. The two were ecstatic, as they would finally be able to have a better life, but both were very cautious and talked a lot about what to do with the money. They invested in land, soybean plantations, corn, and various fruits and vegetables. Both knew how to run their business, and therefore they became successful entrepreneurs. A few years later, Rachel and Michael had several hectares of land, produced tons of soybeans, and were millionaires. But for both, something was still missing. They wanted a child, but even with money and medical treatment, Rachel could not get pregnant, and soon her age would no longer allow her to have children. The two thought about adopting a child, but to their happiness, Rachel finally got pregnant. Several years later, Rachel and Michael were already an old couple and were thinking about retiring. However, all their businesses would be managed by their son David. David means beloved or dear, as he was very loved by his parents. He already worked managing part of Rachel and Michael's business. David grew up having everything he could wish for, but never had his parents very present, as Rachel and Michael always worked a lot and were quite absent, but they did everything so that their son lacked nothing. Due to this absence, David was raised from his childhood by his nanny, Isabel. He spent most of his life with Isabel than with his parents, Rachel and Michael. For being almost 30 years in the family, Isabel was treated as a member of it and was very loved by Rachel and Michael. However, David was more closed off to everyone. He didn't talk much and was rarely at home. Rachel and Michael felt distant from their son and were sad about it. However, they were comforted by their son being a good person and never having done anything wrong in life. One day, David was at home and his parents had traveled. Isabel had just made dinner and served it to David. The food was delicious as always, but suddenly David screamed in pain. He had bitten something very hard and spit out the food. He realized that among the beans there was a piece of stone. He looked in the mirror and his tooth had cracked a bit. Isabel immediately came to see what had happened, and when she realized it came from the food she made, Isabel apologized several times. She was dazed and worried. At that moment, David yelled at her and called her incompetent, in addition to saying other offenses that made Isabel cry. However, not even Isabel's tears calmed David's fury. He said that she would never cook for him again, and that she could take her things and never come back. She was fired. A few days later, Rachel and Michael returned from their trip. They immediately noticed Isabel's absence. David then explained what happened and that he had fired her. The two were shocked. Isabel had worked with them for almost 30 years. She practically raised David as a son. They questioned David, but he said that it was already done. Rachel and Michael did not question further, as they were both quite tired from the trip, and Rachel was also very sick with the flu and a fever. The next day, even though she was ill, Rachel checked the house's surveillance footage. She then saw her son David making various aggressive gestures at Isabel. For a moment, she feared that her son would do something to her out of anger. Her heart broke seeing Isabel leaving crying through the door. She couldn't believe that her son was capable of such aggression. This left her deeply sad and thoughtful. Rachel's flu was quite severe, so she decided to wait until she was better before taking action. One day, the gardener brought her some herbs that his grandmother had given him, claiming they were medicinal, and that tea made from them would make her feel much better. Rachel thanked the young man for his concern. This made her even more thoughtful, as her son David had not even asked how she was. When she recovered, Rachel visited Isabel alone and heard everything her son had said that day. Rachel started to cry and didn't know where she had gone wrong for her son to be that way. Isabel even apologized to Rachel for the stone in the beans and said she was very tired that day, which might have caused her to overlook it. Isabel still asked if David was okay and if his tooth was still hurting. This made Rachel even sadder because she didn't think her son deserved Isabel's concern, but she understood that Isabel saw David as a second son. When Rachel returned home, her husband Michael was waiting for her with a worried expression. Michael said that after David's behavior towards Isabel, he decided to talk to some people at the company and discovered that David hardly worked. He would have other people do his job, and moreover, he checked the bills on his credit cards, and much of the money was spent on parties, drinks, trips. That's why he was so absent from home. He spent most of his day enjoying himself and not working, just taking advantage of his parents' financial situation. Rachel and Michael spent the whole night thinking about what they had done wrong. They both came to the conclusion that they were not present enough and perhaps pampered David too much to compensate for their absence. But David was already an adult, and for them, there wasn't much they could do to change their son. A few weeks passed, and Rachel and Michael decided to teach their son a lesson. David was at a dealership buying his third car. It was a luxury car, and in his mind, he imagined himself driving it, with everyone looking at him enviously. He liked to flaunt and feel superior to people. It inflated his ego and made him feel good. However, his card was declined. He tried several times but was unsuccessful. Ashamed, he said there was a problem with their machine, but even trying with others didn't work. He left and said he would return later with cash. He went home and told his parents what happened. However, Michael and Rachel were serious and sad. They told him they were bankrupt, that all their assets would be sold, as they were in debt, and everything would be confiscated. David was outraged and called his parents fools for not knowing how to manage their business. His father Michael told him to lower his tone and that from that day on he would have to fend for himself. The house and all their assets would be sold to pay off the debts, and they would move in with Rachel's brother in another city, as they were old and could no longer work. However, they managed to get David a job with an old family friend, as they could no longer support him. David was outraged and said he would go with his parents to his uncle's house, but his father said there wasn't enough room in the house and that he would have to stay behind. Michael and Rachel said they had gathered the little money they had and managed to rent an apartment on the outskirts, as it was the only place they could afford to rent with their limited funds. David was furious and wouldn't stop shouting. However, nothing could be done, and he left the house with just a suitcase and had to take the bus, as even his cars would be sold. Rachel and Michael stayed at home. Rachel couldn't stop crying. They had lied to their son, thinking it was the best way to get him to leave the house. But the lie didn't last long. The next day, David returned to take one of his cars anyway. Then he saw that his parents were still there, as if nothing had happened. David confronted them and discovered the lie. This made him curse at his own parents. Then his mother slapped him and told him she didn't want him there anymore. Rachel said they did their best to make him happy and give him a good life, but it turned him into a mean and lazy person. David was silent. His mother had never hit or yelled at him before. Michael then said they had already done too much for him. They had arranged a place for him to live and a job. David tried to question them, but Michael said he would only receive something from them after they died. David left shaken. He had never seen his parents like this. They didn't respond to his messages and had changed the house locks. He returned to the apartment they had rented and lay down on the bed, exhausted. The apartment was simple, but far from where he had to work. The job wasn't hard, but the salary was nothing compared to what he used to receive from his parents. He used to spend his new salary's worth in just one day. He also struggled initially with taking the always crowded bus or metro. David had to wake up very early due to the distance from his home to his job. He was tired and tried several times to apologize to his parents, but they didn't respond to his messages. At work, David felt inferior to others, as he had always been in a higher position at his parents' company. It was a strange feeling for him. Over time, he had to get used to what he earned. Parties were no longer possible. He couldn't afford luxuries. David began to save even on food, as buying too much meant he wouldn't be able to pay the rent. However, he thought his parents would soon give in. But days passed and turned into months. Then he realized he wouldn't be going back home. Over time, David got used to it and began to manage what he earned, and even stopped missing his parties and trips, but still didn't like the life he was leading. David eventually met some residents of the building. The first person he met was Lorraine. She was a retired lady who lived alone. One day, she went to David's apartment and gave him a shirt as a gift. David thanked her. Lorraine said his clothes were holy and that he should dress well. David thanked her again, saying he couldn't afford to buy clothes because he had to pay rent. He was very grateful and never imagined a stranger would do that for him. Then he met Raymond. Raymond was the same age as David, and the two became friends when the pipe in David's apartment broke and, with no money to fix it, Raymond offered to help. David liked Raymond's friendship. Sometimes he felt lonely, but Raymond would come over when he could, and the two would talk for hours. Another person David met was Mary. Mary was a very humble woman with 3 children who often received help from neighbors. One day, she asked David to take care of her children because she had to go to the doctor and didn't have anyone to leave them with. Since it was Saturday, David agreed. He loved the children. They were well behaved, but he was saddened because they were very thin. He grabbed some things and made spaghetti for the children to eat. They loved the food and thanked him by calling him Uncle David. This made David smile and feel something warm in his heart. One day, all these residents came to talk to David. Mary, Lorraine, and Raymond were at his door because they wanted his help with a social project they were involved in. They were collecting food to make soup for the needy. David gave 3 kilong of food, but Mary asked if he could make the soup, as according to her 3 children, he was a great cook. David smiled and said he would help. He was impressed because they didn't have much, but still gave a small part of what they had to help those in need. The next day, everyone went to the social project's headquarters. David was in the kitchen with others preparing the food. Those who tasted his food praised it, saying it was one of the best they had ever tried. David discovered a talent he didn't know he had. They then went out distributing the food to the homeless. David saw children, men, women, elderly people living on the street in precarious conditions. One of the children was very thin, and her mother gave her part of the food so she could eat more. David saw this and stepped away from everyone. He couldn't stop crying. This reality shock was too much for him. David realized how selfish he had been in life and finally understood that his parents were right. Some months passed. David came home from work and found his friend Raymond crying outside the apartment. David was concerned, and then Raymond confided in him. Raymond's mother was sick. She urgently needed eye surgery, or she could lose her sight completely. As it was an expensive surgery, she would have to wait in line, but it could take up to a year to get the surgery, and by then she would have lost her vision. David reassured him and immediately left. David didn't know if his parents would still want to talk to him, so he went to their house. At the entrance, he waited until his parents appeared. It had been months since they had seen each other, and both Rachel and Michael were quite emotional, but tried not to show it. David then spoke. "I'm sorry for everything I did. I really was a terrible son and deserved the punishment you gave me. No, actually, I deserved worse. You were still good to give me a place to live and a job. I know I don't deserve it, but I want to ask for something for a friend. A friend's mother needs urgent surgery, or she could lose her sight. I need you to help me. You don't have to give me the money, just help her with the surgery." Rachel and Michael were moved by their son's request. Michael then said he would give the money to him, that he would try to trust his son again. He hugged his parents and immediately went to talk to Raymond and gave him the money. Raymond was shocked by the amount of money, but didn't question it. He just thanked his friend. Raymond's mother then had the surgery and was no longer at risk of losing her vision. David started keeping in touch with his parents and occasionally went to their house. He didn't ask to return, but his parents wanted him to come back. But they didn't tell him because they wanted to be sure he had changed. One day, someone knocked on David's door. It was Isabel, the woman who had taken care of him since childhood and whom he had fired and been rude to. David was surprised and immediately hugged her. He apologized for what he had done. This made Isabel emotional. Both sat down and talked about what David was doing. Shortly after, someone else knocked on David's door. It was Raymond. When he saw Isabel, Raymond said hello and mentioned her name. Raymond then asked if she would return to live in the building. David then discovered that the apartment he was living in was the apartment where Isabel used to live. After David fired her, his parents had talked to her so that Isabel could come back. She agreed, but David's parents asked her to work full-time with them for a while, as they were going to kick David out of the house. Isabel agreed, but felt sorry for David. So, she told him that he could live there. The apartment was hers, and she would not charge anything. Besides, the residents were good people. David's parents accepted, but he would pay rent, and all the money would go to Isabel. David was surprised and started to laugh. He said he was happy that he could repay what he did to Isabel, even if it was financially. However, Isabel held no grudges against him. She then said that it was time for him to go back home, as she missed her home and his parents were longing for their son. David then returned home. Rachel and Michael were very happy to have their son back. They noticed that David had finally changed. David resumed his position in his parents' company, but this time he worked harder than others. He regularly visited the friends he made in Isabel's building. David also helped them with whatever he could. In addition, every weekend he joined the residents and brought food to those in need. However, with David's help, they were able to assist hundreds of people. Helping others completed him. David finally felt fulfilled and in the end thanked his parents for the harsh but necessary lesson he had received. I hope you liked the story. Like, comment, and share. Thank you for watching.